All right, g'day everyone, and welcome to the Vassals of Kingsgrave live panel at the Ice and Fire Con 2019. For those of you who don't know, the Vassals of Kingsgrave is a Song of Ice and Fire podcast that runs out of the Podcast of Ice and Fire message boards. We have hosts all over the world, some of you in the audience, and we've assembled 3 hosts today to talk to you. My name is Duncan. I also go by the name Valkyrist on the internet. And I am also joined by...
Yep, my name is Casey. I'm also on Vassals of Kingsgrave. I'm Blue-Eyed Queen on the forums.
I'm Dan. I'm known as Witless Chum on the forums. And I haven't been on as many podcasts as these guys, but for some reason they let me on the panel.
You're a smart guy.
We appreciate it. Okay, so the title of our panel is Words Cut Deeper Than Swords. And Casey, would you like to tell us what it's going to be about?
Yeah, so we basically picked some of our favorite quotes from the books. Our podcast is very book central. Thing that we're doing right now is a chronological chapter reread of the A Song of Ice and Fire books, and we like to analyze every single little word in each chapter. So we figured if we're going to do something here, we might as well take some quotes and spew out some thoughts about them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about with A Song of Ice and Fire, comparisons to history, military strategy, lots of crazy theories, but we also just love the writing, the language, the dialogue. It's really what compels us, makes the characters so rich. So we're going to talk about that and list some of our favorite lines or passages from the books. And Casey, I think you're going to take us away with the first quote.
Yep. So if you don't listen to me on VOK, which is totally fine, you will know that I'm a big Sansa fan. And so I chose some Sansa lines, specifically Sansa 7 of A Storm of Swords. And this is probably my favorite chapter of the books. I know it's many people's favorite chapters of the books. But this is, at the Eyrie, Sansa awakens to find it's snowing outside. She wanders outside and begins to sculpt a snow castle, slowly forming it into a replica of Winterfell. So I'm just going to read. I have 2 passages from this chapter that I'll read. And can everybody hear me? What do I sound like? Great. Sansa drifted past frosted shrubs and thin dark trees, and wondered if she were still dreaming. Drifting snowflakes brushed her face as light as a lover's kiss, and melted on her cheeks. At the center of the garden, beside the statue of the weeping woman that lay broken and half buried on the ground, she turned her face up to the sky and closed her eyes. She could feel the snow on her lashes, taste it on her lips. It was the taste of Winterfell, the taste of innocence, the taste of dreams. And so we started this section here with, Sansa in a moment of not fearing for her life finally after, all of Clash and basically being in King's Landing and just worrying about what Cersei or what Joffrey will do to her next, not really being able to trust anyone and finally being able to be in a moment where she can just be free of all that. And so I'll read the next section.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. The snow fell and the castle rose. 2 walls ankle high this is when she's building the castle. The snow fell and the castle rose. 2 walls ankle high, the inner taller than the outer. Towers and turrets, keeps and stairs, a round kitchen, a square armory, the stables along the inside of the west wall. It was only a castle when she began, but before long Sansa knew it was Winterfell. She found twigs and fallen branches beneath the snow and broke off the ends to make trees for the gods' wood. For the gravestones in the lich yard, she used bits of bark. Soon her gloves and her boots were crusty white. Her hands were tingling and her feet were soaked and cold, but she did not care. The castle was all that mattered. I really just love this chapter. It's interesting seeing Sansa in this role because I feel like we think of her not always as a very stark character. We think of her a lot as the princess and the one who's a little bit naive and very innocent of the real world of Westeros. But in this moment, she's clearly yearning for home and wanting to get back to her roots. Really, remember that she's a Stark.
Yeah. This whole chapter is just so thick with yearning.
Yeah.
And yearning for home. And it's like Sansa's gone through this whole journey of not wanting to be kept in the provinces, wanting to see the big city, wanting to experience life and live the fairy tales. And she got her dream and it turned out to be a nightmare, and now all she can think of is these like memories of comfort and safety and the family, and it's all so beautifully like portrayed here, not necessarily like told to us, but just through kind of this sensory beautiful imagery, this deep longing for something that she can't actually put words to. So it's like, again, even though she's relatively safer here than she is in King's Landing, she still having to embody this role of Elaine to keep her safe. She's under the tutelage of Littlefinger, who's very shady and threatening.
Creepy.
Very creepy. So she still can't, say what's in her heart. She's been having to push that down for so long that it almost can't be reached anymore, those memories and who she is. But just in this quiet, very quiet moment alone, and it's so like haunting. It's like the dark of night, it's shifting shadows. She's wandering through the snow. It's so dreamlike.
Yeah.
The imagery, it's so ethereal. She describes like walking through the snow, but not hearing any footprints.
Yeah.
And she can't say it, but almost unconsciously she starts building this castle and realizing only halfway through what she's building what's in her heart.
I feel like this passage is super dreamlike. We get a lot of like, it even says like the taste of dreams. Like you kind of wonder like how she's feeling in this moment. She's almost wary to like feel this way and like just happy to be in the moment.
What do you have like an interpretation of what this means? Like, because I guess there's a lot of speculation about where Sansa's path is taking her. Is she eventually going to become, return to Winterfell, reclaim her name, blah blah blah? Yeah. Or I wasn't sure if it was even a much sadder scene where she's almost saying goodbye to Winterfell. Like she's sort of picturing it one last time, and so she can sort of get closure on it.
Yeah.
And it's the beauty of it is like the fragility of it, like the snow melting in her hair, and the castle itself is described as very fragile. It gets smashed by
Robin.
By Sweet Robin, the evil giant. But even snow itself is such a fragile, temporary thing. It melts. It's impermanent. It is almost like the dream state she describes. So do you think it's a hopeful thing or it's a very sad scene?
It's weird because in the books, if we're just reading the books and we forget everything that's happened in the show, like I would say that she's expelling all of her Stark roots. Like, this is the last time I'm going to remember Winterfell. This is when I'm really going to become Elaine.
Yeah. Oh, God.
Yeah. But this might serve later on when and if we get the rest of the books. This is maybe a reminder to us that, even though Sansa has been in King's Landing for a really long time, she's now in the Eyrie, and she's not close to Winterfell. She's usually not thinking too much about Winterfell. She may come back to it eventually. That was her childhood. Her innocence lives there.
And I guess it's almost, the castle itself is very symbolic, because we know, all the Starks know that the castle's been destroyed and sacked and left to ruin. But like the idea of the castle is still there. So it could be hopeful in the sense that maybe the castle's destroyed, maybe House Stark is destroyed, but I still remember what it was and what it could be again. It's like that flickering kind of fragile dream or whatever that she could put form to. What did you enjoy did you like this chapter, Dan, or do you remember the first time you read it?
Yeah, it's iconic, and I don't know, I like snow, so it really hit me a lot because of that.
Thumbs up. Top-notch snow.
Just the description of like, you could just hear the silence when it's first snowing and the snow's muffling all the sound, like Martin describes, and at least I could just see the giant flakes coming down and stuff like that, and it's just such an evocative chapter, like you said. Yeah,
there's so much imagery, like in this chapter, with the snow. A lot of similes as well. The snowflakes brushed her face as light as a lover's kiss, and it's kind of interesting that she uses that because, like, does she really know what love is at this point? Or she has an idealized feeling of love.
Yeah, it is still very saturated with this romantic fairy tale language, which in some ways she's learned the falsity or the danger of, that if you coat something in this romanticism, you don't see the danger beneath. So it's almost like she's saying goodbye to her childhood, I guess, as well, and just saying, all right, this was what I was, and now I just have to like let it go and become an adult, in a sense, become Elaine, see the world as it really is. The way it's been taught to her by people like Littlefinger and the Hound and Cersei, I guess. to an extent.
Yeah, I think it really works on the level of childhood and her kind of, experiencing childhood one last time in the, here by building this castle and then kind of putting it away, even if she's, even if it's not, the thing you said earlier about her embracing her new role as Elaine Stone, if it's just about her embracing her new role as an adult.
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it can...
And maybe even becoming a leader.
Yeah,
I hope.
I think so, yeah, absolutely. I think she's positioned as a potential leader or a potential active player in the game.
Yeah.
Any more to say, or should we move on to the next one?
Well, VOK is all about getting everybody to participate. So if you guys want to shout out or anything or have any thoughts, feel free to raise your hand or shout. I don't know.
Well, then raise your hand. All right, so for my first favorite quote is from Daenerys 10 from A Dance with Dragons, which is the final Daenerys chapter we get. And it's Dany walking back south through the Dothraki Sea towards Meereen. She gets sick on the way and has a number of hallucinations as she lies in the grass, bleeding and dying. So this is the quote. She sat up, afraid that she had soiled herself while she slept. When she brought her fingers to her face, she could smell the blood on them. Am I dying? Then she saw the pale crescent moon, floating high above the grass, and it came to her that this was no more than her moon blood. If she had not been so sick and scared, that might have come as a relief. Instead, she began to shiver violently. She rubbed her fingers through the dirt and grabbed handfuls of grass to wipe between her legs. The dragon does not weep. She was bleeding, but it was only woman's blood. The moon is still a crescent, though. How can that be? She tried to remember the last time she had bled. The last full moon? The one before? The one before that? No, it cannot be so long as that. I am the blood of the dragon, she told the grass aloud. Once, the grass whispered back, until you chained your dragons in the dark. Drogon killed a little girl. Her name... Dany could not recall the child's name. That made her so sad that she would have cried if all the tears had not been burned away. I will never have a little girl. I was the mother of dragons. The grass said, but you turned against your children. And this is one of those quotes that I didn't really notice the first time I was reading it. I guess part of that is just like the frustration with the Marinese plot line and the sort of the very complex political nature of it, that I think Dany's actual psychological journey often gets lost amidst that. This is kind of the first time we see her alone in a couple of books, really. I mean, I don't think we've ever really seen her alone except for maybe early in the first book. So in many ways, she's kind of dealing with the fact that she's shed all of this power structure and regality and artifice of the world and the political machinery that has like totally controlled her life, and the way that the people who've raised her have controlled her life. And she's alone, and suddenly she's confronted with the fact that she doesn't know who she is. One of her mantras is, if I look back, I'm lost. And the whole point of this chapter is she is lost. She's completely lost in the desert, and she's finally having to look back and reflect on her memories and the things she's done and where she went off the road, where she went off course, and how she can maybe get back. So it's a lot of people from the past talking to her. But I think what's really striking about this, and a couple of articles have talked about this, I think the Marinese Blot does a really good analysis, but it's basically part of Dany's conflict is that, sort of the founding trauma of Daenerys is losing her child, and that trauma or that need, that want for a child, that want to be a mother has been originally sublimated into the dragons. They were her children. She calls herself the mother of dragons, but also the liberated slaves. They call her Mysa. She calls them her children, and it's almost like she has to choose between these two children. And in many ways, she chooses the liberated slaves, possibly because she feels so much sympathy for them, because in essence she was a slave for much of her life, or treated as one. But by doing that, she chained away or shut away a fundamental part of herself. So she tried for diplomacy, and she tried to change people's minds, but she shut off this essential part of her Targaryenness, which is this sort of will to power or this will to conquer. I think it was Jorah maybe. Hallucination of Jorah is you're a conqueror, you've forgotten who you are. So it feels like she's in a very fever dreamish way, she's kind of trying to navigate those two conflicting personalities, maybe. I don't know if you guys had any thoughts about this scene, or if it said much to you the first time you read it. I felt like it was kind of a gross scene that I was like, oh, what is this? Where can we get back to the story? But it feels like increasingly important.
Yeah, this is a great line to read at 10 o'clock in the morning when I'm still just waking up. And,
yeah. Totally. Better than coffee.
But one thing I think about this, as a woman, like Dani hasn't really had any maternal or women like people to look up to or people to ask questions to. She's suffering through part of every woman's life alone, and not even like just here, but like alone throughout the entire series, really. And she's learning herself. She's learning like how to be a good leader, go towards eventually being queen, presumably, in Westeros and taking back her throne. And I feel like that's like a really tough place to be in as a woman. That's like my big thought with that.
That's a really interesting point, that Daenerys has, very few sort of male role models to look up to, and like no women. I mean, assuming Quaithe is a woman, she would be the closest thing, right?
Yeah. And she's really confusing.
I think it pairs quite well with the Sansa chapter as well, as being very dreamlike and evoking a very sort of disoriented psyche. Mm-hmm. This shifting, not knowing, like this like liminal space between the past and the present and the future and memory and reality and fantasy all works really well. I'm not sure of like the symbolism of the grass speaking to her.
I mean, they are both like doing stuff with the ground around them.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Like the nature itself becomes like a texture of her like in a world.
Yeah,
sort of like she projects onto it or something.
It makes sense for the grass to speak to her though, because she's basically part Dothraki at this point. Culturally at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and she's out on the Dothraki Sea, so in some ways it's sort of like the ancestral spirits of the Dothraki are whispering to her a little bit, because they would probably also tell her to conquer and fire and blood, just like her own ancestors would.
Yeah.
To go forward, you must go back.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting the fact that she forgets the child Hazia's name, because that's sort of one of the mantras of her storyline in A Dance of Dragons. It's a really shocking thing. It sort of alters her course, the death of this child by the dragon. It kind of turns her against the dragons, but also turns her against like a part of her own nature that she didn't realize was so dangerous, that we see in book 3, this conqueror persona. She's sort of like this whiplash away from that, this rejection of that part of her. And she's like, I'll remember this child's name. I'm not a monster. I'm not the Mad King. I remember. I'm still connected to my humanity. But at the end of the book, it's vanished. It's disappeared from her mind. And I'm not sure what that suggests. Maybe that she's sort of become so submerged and like suffocated by, I don't know, this path or this political machinery or this Game of Thrones. But also I feel like it's slightly connected to maybe her own child, the fact that it was someone that never received a name and someone that's kind of vanished from her, or a part of her that she always wanted to hang on to, but it's kind of just vanished into memory. And again, it goes back to, if I look back, I'm lost. But she's sort of taken that so seriously that she can't connect to who she is. And if she doesn't look back, she's lost, because she doesn't know who she is. And she's still trying to figure that out, I guess. And maybe the point of the chapter is she's never going to be an effective ruler if she doesn't know who she is. She can't govern her own sort of path. How can she govern like the Seven Kingdoms path forward?
Zach?
Do you feel that there's any concern that between Dani hearing the grass speak to her and forgetting Hazia's name, that she may be tipping into the Targaryen madness?
I mean, it's definitely possible. I don't, it was funny, actually listening to the Rhaegar panel last night, I was kind of like, oh, maybe Rhaegar is a little bit crazy too. So, but like, not as like evil as King Aerys was. So I think it's definitely a possibility. I wonder if she will be, especially with like the last episode of the show, be a little bit delusional about her claim to the throne and like how things are going to work out for her.
Yeah, it's almost like a bit like the Starks. The Targaryens seem to, their strong sort of wargame connection with their dragons and the propensity to have these kind of dreaming visions almost suggests they have one foot in this kind of spiritual plane or this metaphysical plane, that they're connected to the same plane as the three-eyed crow or something. It's never really clear. This kind of subterranean nature of the world, and that can cause greatness, but it can also cause madness in a sense. Yes.
Yeah, it's quite a coincidence because I just realized like 5 minutes ago that Daenerys and Viserys and Rhaegar, they have two great grandparents. Their parents were brother and sister. Their parents were brother and sister. I just realized that in like 2 days ago when I was reading, All of Ice and Fire. I mean, even for Targaryens, that's very close. Because in real European history, there was the Spanish prince Don Carlos. He was quite a man, and in Wikipedia they noticed, he only had 4 great grandparents instead of 8 like all normal people. Well, 4. Those people have 2.
Yes, that's a good point. We're not sure what that does to a person about that. That's, yeah.
I tend to agree with the interpretation that this passage is Martin telling us that Dany is going to go, more to the Conqueror side in the next, in the Winds of Winter and maybe into a Dream of Spring where, it's going to be a bad day to be a Volantene and probably a bad day to be a Pentashi. And, she's just going to embrace that side of her, and we're going to see much more of that and much less of the Breaker of Chains.
And that entwining of like her hallucinatory psychology and this will to power could bode for a possible dark days for Westeros in a sense. Maybe a possible Mad Queen. I don't know. Like that would be an interesting twist, I think. But she's obviously fighting against that.
Yeah.
She's not the sort of level of entitlement maybe that her forefathers had. Maybe because she struggled more and seen the suffering of the small folk. Maybe that will alter her conception of a new 7 kingdoms. We'll have to see. But do you guys make much of the bleeding? Some people have suggested that might be a potential that she's possible to bear children again, or her womb quickened, to quote Mary Mazdur. Is there much to be seen there, or is it just a product of her sickness, do you think?
I think she's just really stressed out.
Just stress, having a bad day, yeah. Yeah. Yes?
My mother actually was the first one to point that out to me, that she feels she can't reflect when her last cycle was, that was probably a miscarriage.
Okay, well, wow.
She could have been pregnant.
Right.
And that it is possible for her to have a child.
Okay, that would be interesting. Yes?
I was just wondering why she suppressed that so much. Like, she says herself it's just one, but yet she appears in her dress and just playing off.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just she's not well. She's incredibly dehydrated. She sees blood. She thinks it's a wound and is not sure. Is it sickness? Is it? Yeah, I think it's just her scattered kind of mind. She hasn't been able to reflect on this. Maybe she can when she gets back and hopefully is in a state of mind. She can think more about it. But it's really like live or die at this point. That kind of forward thinking isn't really possible. Any more to say on this passage?
With going off of what Pasha was talking about, I wonder with like how much of a influence Viserys had on her growing up, how like that influenced how to like block the crazy from her, and maybe in this moment even like freaking out that she could be turning that way because she's physically like freaking out in a sense.
Dan, would you like to read us your quote?
Sure. All right, I actually chose a passage that hadn't stuck out to me until just this spring when I was trying to reread the books before the con, and this little description really stood out for me. That it's in the Catelyn 4 chapter in A Clash of Kings when Cat and her escort are fleeing Renly's camp after the Shadow Assassin murders Renly, and they're taking Brienne along, and it just struck me as a really good example of something that we don't really talk about as much as like how good Martin is at describing sort of like the natural world and the world that he's created. And I'm somebody who tends to have more time for the travelogue aspects of A Dance with Dragons and A Feast for Crows, for instance, because I really like this stuff. So I don't see any pitchforks or torches, so that's okay. But so this is from Catelyn 4. Renly's battles were coming apart as the rumors spread from mouth to mouth. The night fires had burned low, and as the east began to lighten, The immense mass of Storm's End emerged like a dream of stone, while wisps of pale mist raced across the field, flying from the sun on wings of wind. Morning ghosts, she had heard old Nan call them once, spirits returning to their graves, and Renly, one of them now, gone like his brother Robert, like her own dear Ned. So that passage just really stuck out to me for the description of Storm's End as a dream of stone. Like, what the hell is a dream of stone? But it sticks in my mind like that. Like I know what he means, even if I can't define that. So that just seemed to really hit me as a really good description of the physical world. And it just works really well too, as they're fleeing this horrific supernatural event that both the characters in the books and we as the audience did not expect to have happen, where all of a sudden a shadow that looks kind of Stannis-y just murders Renly out of nowhere. So the passage really stood out to me too, with the morning ghosts and the reference to old Nan and her old stories. And we know that old Nan always tells the truth in her stories. So
Definitely. I find it funny that like the three passages that we all picked have like something about like dreaming in them, and I wonder if I don't know if that says something about us, or if that says something about like our podcast, or if that says something about how George writes. But
I think just George is obsessed with dreams and what they reveal about it. Like a lot of the most revelatory moments for characters seem to occur in dreams or visions or memories, sort of these faded memories, like the Tower of Joy for Ned is kind of, it's something that's been repressed, that has only emerged from the subconscious when he's not quite in control of his mind. Jaime's fever dream after he gets his hand chopped off and makes the decision to go back to save Brienne. Like, these are all really pivotal moments. Prophecy and mystery and conspiracy and visions, just they play a huge role in the story, even though they seem peripheral. They like govern a lot of decisions, and a lot of our knowledge of the world and the characters comes through these little portholes, these sort of gaps in the assumed facade or whatever.
yeah.
On the subject of dreams, do you think they are organic or sent by someone else to change their course of action? Like maybe via a glass candle or something different?
I kind of think of the supernatural-esque part of this world in Westeros as being kind of like all related, kind of all-encompassing, R'hllor and all that. I wonder if there's something supernatural going on, but I don't know if that would be like through like a person or through like, just like the world warning people that things are coming.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like a specific agent giving them the things. It might just be them becoming aware of things. And I guess there's two categories. There's just the normal dreams that we experience where we realize some things that we've forgotten or that sort of come back to us from our past, which can be described in psychology. But also, Martin seems to be positing this plane of reality that's not accessible by like normal human senses, but can be maybe through dreams. So people can become aware of these kind of future paths through altered states, whether it's dreams, whether it's touches with the sort of the afterlife that Patchface and Bran experience, that gives them a stronger connection to this plane, or just sleep, I think. Yes, Matt?
Yeah, I just want to follow on a statement there where I think it's more, it's more organic in most cases. And that particular example with Jaime falling asleep on the werewood stone, where it's just, the characters coming in his passage, so kind of almost, after witnessing some supernatural event, they're feeling the magic that's come off of Storm's End, and how it was constructed and built back in the day. So I think it's just the characters in the story coming into contact with the supernatural elements that are kind of placed throughout the world, but most people don't notice it either.
Yeah, which I think is crucial to the fantasy story that Martin's trying to say. It's not that magic is this discrete thing, it actually just flows through and interlaces everyday life.
Yeah, and it also seems like there's some similarity, like there's something about like certain places and certain, like I'm thinking of like that Melisandre chapter that I just read recently for one of the podcasts where she like feels like so much more powerful by the wall, even though she's not yet getting that Jon Snow is the Snow that she's seeing, or the Azor Ahai that she's asking for.
Yeah,
She doesn't.
I ordered another Azor Ahai.
But yeah, I mean, it's all kind of connected around.
It also reminds me, this is Clash, this is also the scene of Varys' great story about the shadow on the wall, which he seems to imply it's like, it's not necessarily magic, or it's magic insofar as enough people believe it's magic that it convinces them to act accordingly. So the wall is this great like focal point, or this fulcrum of human history and experience, and the same with Storm's End, that it evokes those kinds of intense feelings. Again, it's their state of mind. They're incredibly panicked, so it is this kind of chaotic flight away from Storm's End, where it assumes this kind of threatening sensory experience.
It makes me think also of the probably the most iconic moment in Clash, the whole House of the Undying experience, where it kind of appears as if the Undying are people who actually live in this world beyond the world that Duncan was talking about. And, Daenerys has to enter their world and defeat them and then get away in the real world too. And so it made me think of that. Like there's, sort of connections with that throughout the books.
And this, that appears in Clash as well. So like this is definitely, if the first book was very rooted in medieval realism and politics, this is very much Martin warming up the magic settings.
Moving up
story. So we get the House of the Undying, but we also get the Shadow Baby, which appears here, and this is the sort of aftermath of that experience, and they don't understand it. We don't really understand it either. But it is this. But yeah, I think that the connection to Varys is interesting. It's both. He's describing a metaphorical shadow, but we see a literal shadow. So it's not. I guess Varys' point is that it's reality is fixed, and it's about power comes from narrative and propaganda or persuasion or conditions, whereas Melisandre is much more about the magical world and the ethereal plane, and our world is sort of this fleeting, melting snow castle or whatever. But here we sort of see the two combined in this really evocative way. And again, it sort of returns to memory, a bit like Sansa. That last line is "my own dear Ned." So like, Catelyn is in fear, and she immediately reaches out to something that's like important to her, that like ekes out.
Given this description of Storm's End as of course, knowing Storm's End is one piece of big structures and one story, so it's so beyond the understanding of characters and messengers and what occasions like. Do you think it could be possible to say that in the time where Storm's End and the Wall and some of the things were constructed in magic and in the data world, that there may have not even been dreams because they were so connected and so part of the supernatural that it was just a part of their life? And there became a point where there was a veil drawn between the two, and now we have the physical world bereft of magic that is only active and can only access the supernatural.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I like that idea, because the stories of the Children of the Forest and the First Men, they seem to be able to speak literally to the old gods and whatnot, and we see a literal representation of the three-eyed raven as this this kind of mediator between those worlds.
We also see the wall might be like a physical representation of like this guard against magic almost, since most of what we see is like very much beyond the wall.
And Melisandre calls the wall one of the hinges of the world, which goes to what you're talking about like closing in those kinds of connections to this magical metaphysical world. I also think it works well with like the fantasy genre in general, that the fantasy genre was a product of like this kind of modern world, or this Enlightenment thinking that was like superstition needs to be pushed away and we need to go towards progress and science and modernism, this rational view of the world, whereas Martin's like, no, let's not discount superstition and magic and fantasy entirely. There's something that's fundamental to our humanity about it. Maybe not call it magic, but something like that, some spiritual kind of context. But we probably have time for a couple more quotes. Did you want to go to your second
Sure.
quote?
So back to Sansa, my favorite.
Always.
So I'm going to talk about this Sansa, a couple sections in Clash of Kings, mostly about Sansa and Sandor Clegane. A controversial matchup for some people, or for me too. But after meeting with Sir Dantos, Sansa does not want to return to her room, she goes up to the roof where she is surprised by the Hound. Clegane is in a foul mood as ever and tells her that he enjoys killing. So here's the passage. Aren't you afraid? The gods might send you down to some terrible hell for all the evil you've done. What evil? He laughed. What gods? The gods who made us all.
Oh God! What did you say? Ominous bells.
All, he mocked. Tell me, little bird, what kind of god makes a monster like the imp, or a half-wit like Lady Tange's daughter? If there are gods, what they made sheep so wolves could eat mutton, and they made the weak for the strong to play with. True knights protect the weak. He snorted. There are no true knights, no more than there are gods. If you can't protect yourself, die and get out of the way of those who can. Sharp steel and strong arms rule this world. Don't ever believe any different. Sansa backed away from him. You're awful. I'm honest. It's the world that's awful. Now fly away, little bird. I'm sick of you peeping at me. And the little bird banter that he does throughout this book, it's kind of funny. It's also kind of sad. Because, this is the Hound basically, arguing with her, to see the reality. You're just a little bird. Look out for all these people who are going to be hurting you, or people are hurting you right now. And, back to the first section that I was talking about, or back to the quote I was talking about in Storm, it's part of her journey to, release her innocence, but she's clearly still, very innocent in this chapter, and talking about true knights and such. I like the imagery of a little bird because it's she could easily fly away. But
yeah, I mean, it's good because it suggests something sort of delicate and pretty, but ultimately very vulnerable and caged, and even something that maybe not enjoys, but is kind of okay with its cage, which is Sansa. Obviously, she's caged both physically by the Lannisters, but also by the society she's been born into, is very repressive and patriarchal and whatnot. And she's bought into that fairy tale. That's part of her identity. And he's saying, no, look at the way you've been caged. Don't look at how pretty the bars are. Realize what's happening to you. See the world as it truly is. And I think it's really interesting that, Xander Clegane is awful, but it's interesting that someone's so unknight-like in Caen, in appearance and disposition, is also one of the most honest and straightforward with Sansa. He's awful, but he's the one of the few people that's trying to give her advice and help her and try and get it through her head that this is not the way the world works. Maybe it should be, but who knows? But he's a very nihilistic person, obviously because of what he's been through. So in some sense, I think he acts as this kind of dark father figure to people like Sansa and Arya, where he sees the innocence in them that he once had that is being horribly ripped away from them, and he wants to guide them a little bit. But he's also battling against his horrible nature. He's done terrible things. He will go on to do terrible things. So he's a complex character, but I think their relationship is really interesting as this kind of Beauty and the Beast kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in a romantic way, but...
I think that George really kind of sets this up in that way almost. Sansa really wants a knight to sweep her off her feet and take her away from this evil, and God gave her Sandor to tell her to stop thinking about that and to think about the real world. And it's ironic, but also it's supposed to really teach her that knights may have a bad quality about them.
Yeah.
And Sandor really wears it on his face.
Yeah, which isn't healthy at all. I feel like he wills it into existence because he wants to. I think the allusions to the gods are interesting and work sort of well with our previous discussion, as all of these characters trying to negotiate this spiritual realm and him just completely rejecting it and saying, no, this is the way it is. We're almost animals, and we basically it's survival of the fittest. And I don't need a god. I've got a sword. This is the only god I need, and I can rule the world with this.
My not so crackpot theory about Sansa is that they'll end up living on the Quiet Isle because, Sansa is very, close to her religion, to the point where she's, going to the Godswood, going to the Sept, constantly praying for help or support or whatever. And I feel like, eventually she'll just be so silent and her and Sandor can have their quiet life together finally.
I don't know. It is interesting that he's so sort of viciously atheist in this, but his final resting place is finding some kind of peace in the Quiet Isle.
Hopefully,
with religion, maybe. Well, I hope so. I hope he kind of vanishes into the story. I don't really want Clegane Ball. I think it's more elegant if we don't fully know his fate and he can sort of live on in memory or whatever. Did you have any thoughts on this passage, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, it's just throughout Clash, the combination of Sansa and Sandor it's really fascinating because I think we're supposed to, not to necessarily take Sandor at face value. Like, Martin's not telling us that the world is the way Sandor says it is, but he's also telling us that, it's not the way Sansa originally thought it was either. And it's really fascinating to me to see the two characters sort of average out into maybe a more realistic or workable view of the world, where maybe because there are true knights in Martin's world, and Sandor's not necessarily one, but there are some. There's Brienne at least, and
I really like the conversations, just like the contrast between the delicacy and courtesy of her language and the horrible brutishness of his language, and the way they appear to each other.
The way his voice is described as a rasp all the time.
Yeah. It's like this sort of negative charge that somehow finds a common humanity between them. Like they recognize, and the final meeting of them too, where she looks at him in the eyes and he's almost ashamed of what he is and walks away. It's a really beautiful sort of relationship, or some kind of shared sympathy or seeing beauty in the monster and whatever.
Yeah.
Did you guys see we got the 5 minutes?
Yeah, we got the 5-minute marker.
Oh, okay. So we've got 5 more minutes until we wrap up, but I think, Dan, you had something you wanted to finish on?
Yeah, I came up with a little game based on another podcast I listened to where they give 3 things that are facts and 1 thing that's fiction. So we're going to play fiction or fan fiction. So during the books, Cersei Lannister basically tries to have much of the cast murdered at one time or another, right? So I'm going to read several names of characters whom Cersei has tried to have murdered at some point. So most of these are going to be correct. One of them is going to be fan fiction. You guys have to tell me which one is the fan fiction that Cersei did not have to try to have murdered at any point in the books. So I'm going to read the names for once, and then I'm going to read them again, and I'm going to have everybody clap once for the person you think Cersei did not try to have murder, okay? So, Marjorie Tyrell, Gendry Waters, Sir Bronn of the Blackwater, Jon Snow, and Eddard Stark. Eddard Stark.
Ned.
You use his full name. You respect him, Pasha. So, who thinks it was Marjorie? Just to be clear, you're clapping if you think Cersei did not try to get Marjorie killed at any point in the books. So, Marjorie, Gendry, Sir Bronn, Jon Snow, and Ned. All right, you guys have read these books. Because Cersei never actually tries to get Ned killed. That was
Joffrey.
That was Joffrey.
Yeah. And Littlefinger.
Joffrey with probably Littlefinger, we assume.
Okay, so I think that wraps up our discussion. Was there any final questions or any quotes people wanted to shout out in the next minute or so?
Speaking of just quotes and interactions, do you have something that you were looking forward to, an actual exchange between 2 characters that hopefully would be in the next book?
Dany and
Not a specific thing, but one scene that you want.
I think Dany and Tyrion. I'm really looking forward to their meeting.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to how the books will write that up.
Yeah.
They want to get going. They're done.
All right. So, we're going to end with one final quote, which is from the Prince of Winterfell in A Dance with Dragons. "The best pie you have ever tasted, my lords. Wash it down with arbor gold and save every bite." And my sister in the back, dressed as a Mormont, has some lovely meat pies that anyone would like to try.
Seriously, they're good.
So, thank you all for coming.
Real meat pies.
As we said, we're the Vassals of Kingsgrave. You can subscribe to us on iTunes or YouTube. But if you want to join us for a podcast, go to the A Podcast of Ice and Fire forums and sign up for a podcast, and we'd love to have you. Thanks for coming.
That's the best part of being a
Literally
fan.
anyone can join.
Literally anybody, as long as you know what you're talking about.
Yeah. No, that's not a prerequisite
I
at
never
all.
heard that last part.